Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. Prologue. My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestation, and the personality, too, desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions and to experience itself as a whole. I cannot employ the language of science to trace this process of growth in myself, for I cannot experience myself as a scientific problem. What we are to our inward vision and what man appears to be subspecie aeternitatis can only be expressed by way of myth. Myth is more individual and expresses life more precisely than does science. Science works with concepts of averages, which are far too general to do justice to the subjective variety of an individual life. Thus it is that I have now undertaken in my 83rd year to tell my personal myth. I can only make direct statements, only tell stories. Whether or not the stories are true is not the problem. The only question is whether what I tell is my fable, my truth. An autobiography is so difficult to write because we possess no standards, no objective foundation from which to judge ourselves. There are really no proper bases for comparison. I know that in many things I am not like others, but I do not know what I really am like. Man cannot compare himself with any other creature. He is not a monkey, not a cow, not a tree. I am a man. But what is it to be that? Like every other being, I am a splinter of the infinite deity, but I cannot contrast myself with any animal, any plant, or any stone. Only a mythical being has a range greater than man's. How then can a man form any definite opinions about himself? We are a psychic process which we do not control or only partly direct. Consequently, we cannot have any final judgment about ourselves or our lives. If we had, we would know everything, but at most that is only a pretense. At bottom, we never know how it has all come about. The story of a life begins somewhere, at some particular point we happen to remember, and even then it was already highly complex. We do not know how life is going to turn out. Therefore, the story has no beginning, and the end can only be vaguely hinted at. The life of man is a dubious experiment. It is a tremendous phenomenon only in numerical terms. Individually, it is so fleeting, so insufficient, that it is literally a miracle that anything can exist and develop at all. I was impressed by that fact long ago as a young medical student, and it seemed to me miraculous that I should not have been prematurely annihilated. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. The part that appears above ground lasts only a single summer. Then it withers away, an ephemeral apparition. When we think of the unending growth and decay of life and civilizations, we cannot escape the impression of absolute nullity. Yet I have never lost a sense of something that lives and endures underneath the eternal flux. What we see is the blossom which passes. The rhizome remains. In the end, the only events in my life worth telling are those when the imperishable world erupted into this transitory one. That is why I speak chiefly of inner experiences, amongst which I include my dreams and visions. These form the prima materia of my scientific work. They were the fiery magma out of which the stone that had to be worked was crystallized. All other memories of travels, people, and my surroundings have paled beside these interior happenings. Many people have participated in the story of our times and written about it. If the reader wants an account of that, let him turn to them or get somebody to tell it to him. Recollection of the outward events of my life has largely faded or disappeared. But my encounters with the other reality, my bouts with the unconscious, are indelibly engraved upon my memory. In that realm, there has always been wealth in abundance, and everything else has lost importance by comparison. Similarly, other people are established inalienably in my memories only if their names were entered in the scrolls of my destiny from the beginning, so that encountering them was at the same time a kind of recollection. Inner experiences also set their seal on the outward events that came my way and assumed importance for me in youth or later on. I early arrived at the insight that when no answer comes from within to the problems and complexities of life, they ultimately mean very little. Outward circumstances are no substitute for inner experience. Therefore, my life has been singularly poor in outward happenings. I cannot tell much about them, for it would strike me as hollow and insubstantial. I can understand myself only in the light of inner happenings. It is these that make up the singularity of my life, and with these my autobiography deals. Chapter 1, First Years. When I was 6 months old, my parents moved from Keswill on Lake Constance to Laufen, the castle and vicarage above the Falls of the Rhine. This was in 1875. My memories begin with my second or third year. I recall the vicarage, the garden, the laundry house, the church, the castle, the falls, the small castle of Worth, and the sexton's farm.
These are nothing but islands of memory afloat in a sea of vagueness, each by itself.
Apparently, with no connection between them, one memory comes up, which is perhaps the earliest of my life, and is indeed only a rather hazy impression. I am lying in a pram, in the shadow of a tree. It is a fine, warm summer day, the sky blue and golden sunlight darting through green leaves. The hood of the pram has been left up. I have just awakened to the glorious beauty of the day and have a sense of indescribable well-being. I see the sun glittering through the leaves and blossoms of the bushes. Everything is wholly wonderful, colorful, and splendid. Another memory. I am sitting in our dining room on the west side of the house, perched in a high chair and spooning up warm milk with bits of broken bread in it. The milk has a pleasant taste and a characteristic smell. This was the first time I became aware of the smell of milk. It was the moment when, so to speak, I became conscious of smelling. This memory, too, goes very far back. Still another. A lovely summer evening. An aunt said to me, "Now I am going to show you something." She took me out in front of the house on the road to Dachsen. On the far horizon, the chain of the Alps lay bathed in glowing sunset reds. The Alps could be seen very clearly that evening. "Now look over there," I can hear her saying to me in Swiss dialect. "The mountains are all red." For the first time, I consciously saw the Alps. Then I was told that the next day, the village children would be going on a school outing to the Wetleberg near Zurich. I wanted so much to go too. To my sorrow, I was informed that children as small as I could not go along, there was nothing to be done about it. From then on, the Wetleberg and Zurich became an unattainable land of dreams, near to the glowing, snow-covered mountains. From a somewhat later period comes another memory. My mother took me to the Thurgau to visit friends who had a castle on Lake Constance. I could not be dragged away from the water. The waves from the steamer washed up to the shore. The sun glistened on the water, and the sand under the water had been curled into little ridges by the waves. The lake stretched away and away into the distance. This expanse of water was an inconceivable pleasure tome, an incomparable splendor. At that time, the idea became fixed in my mind that I must live near a lake. Without water, I thought nobody could live at all. Still, another memory comes up. Strangers, bustle, excitement. The maid comes running and exclaims, "The fishermen have found a corpse, came down the falls. They want to put it in the wash housel." My father says, Yes. I want to see the dead body at once."
My mother holds me back and sternly forbids me to go into the garden.
When all the men had left, I quickly stole into the garden to the wash house, but the door was locked. I went around the house. At the back there was an open drain running down the slope,
and I seen blood and water trickling out.
I found this extraordinarily interesting. At that time, I was not yet 4 years old. Yet another image. I am restive, feverish, unable to sleep. My father carries me in his arms, paces up and down, singing his old student songs. I particularly remember one I was especially fond of, and which always used to soothe me. Alles Schweige, Jeder Nege. The beginning went something like that. To this day, I can remember my father's voice, singing over me in the stillness of the night. I was suffering, so my mother told me afterward, from general eczema. Dim intimations of trouble in my parents' marriage hovered around me. My illness in 1878 must have been connected with a temporary separation of my parents. My mother spent several months in a hospital in Basel, and presumably her illness had something to do with the difficulty in the marriage. An aunt of mine, who was a spinster and some 20 years older than my mother, took care of me. I was deeply troubled by my mother's being away. From then on, I always felt mistrustful when the word love was spoken. The feeling I associated with woman was, for a long time, that of innate unreliability. Father, on the other hand, meant reliability and powerlessness. That is the handicap I started off with. Later, these early impressions were revised. I have trusted men friends and been disappointed by them, and I have mistrusted women and was not disappointed. While my mother was away, our maid too looked after me. I still remember her picking me up and laying my head against her shoulder. She had black hair and an olive complexion and was quite different from my mother. I can see even now her hairline, her throat, with its darkly pigmented skin, and her ear. All this seemed to me very strange, and yet strangely familiar. It was as though she belonged not to my family, but only to me, as though she were connected in some way with other mysterious things I could not understand. This type of girl later became a component of my animal, the feeling of strangeness which she conveyed, and yet of having known her always, was a characteristic of that figure which later came to symbolize for me the whole essence of womanhood. From the period of my parents' separation, I have another memory image. A young, very pretty and charming girl with blue eyes and fair hair is leading me on a blue autumn day under golden maple and chestnut trees along the Rhine below the falls near Worth Castle. The sun is shining through the foliage and yellow leaves lie on the ground. This girl later became my mother-in-law. She admired my father. I did not see her again until I was 21 years old. These are my outward memories. What follow now are more powerful, indeed overwhelming images, some of which I recall only dimly. There was a fall downstairs, for example, and another fall against the angle of a stove leg. I remember pain and blood, a doctor sewing a wound in my head. The scar remained visible until my senior year at the gymnasium. My mother told me, too, of the time when I was crossing the bridge over the Rhine Falls to Neuhausen. The maid caught me just in time. I already had one leg under the railing and was about to slip through. These things point to an unconscious suicidal urge, or it may be to a fatal resistance to life in this world. At that time, I also had vague fears at night. I would hear things walking about in the house. The muted roar of the Rhine Falls was always audible, and all around lay a danger zone. People drowned, bodies were swept over the rocks. In the cemetery nearby, the sexton would dig a hole, heaps of brown upturned earth. Black, solemn men in long frock coats with unusually tall hats and shiny black boots would bring a black box. My father would be there in his clerical gown, speaking in a resounding voice. Women wept. I was told that someone was being buried in this hole in the ground. Certain persons who had been around previously would suddenly no longer be there. Then I would hear that they had been buried, and that Lord Jesus had taken them to himself. My mother had taught me a prayer, which I had to say every evening. I gladly did so because it gave me a sense of comfort in face of the vague uncertainties of the night. Spread out thy wings, Lord Jesus mild, and take to thee thy chick, thy child. If Satan would devour it, no harm shall overpower it. So let the angels sing, bright aus die Fluglein beide, O Jesu meine Freude, und nimm den Kuchlein ein. Will Satan as Verschlingen, denn lass die Engel singen. Die's kind soul unverletzet sein. Lord Jesus was comforting a nice, benevolent gentleman like Herr Wagenstein up at the castle, rich, powerful, respected, and mindful of little children at night. Why he should be winged like a bird was a conundrum that did not worry me any further. Far more significant and thought-provoking was the fact that little children were compared to chicks, which Lord Jesus evidently took reluctantly, like bitter medicine. This was difficult to understand, but I understood at once that Satan liked chicks and had to be prevented from eating them. So, although Lord Jesus did not like the taste, he ate them anyway, so that Satan would not get them. As far as that went, my argument was comforting. But now I was hearing that Lord Jesus took other people to himself as well, and that this taking was the same as putting them in a hole in the ground. This sinister analogy had unfortunate consequences. I began to distrust Lord Jesus. He lost the aspect of a big, comforting, benevolent bird and became associated with the gloomy black men in frock coats, top hats, and shiny black boots who busied themselves with the black box. These ruminations of mine led to my first conscious trauma. One hot summer day, I was sitting alone, as usual, on the road in front of the house, playing in the sand. The road led past the house up a hill, then disappeared in the wood on the hilltop. So from the house, you could see a stretch of the road. Looking up, I saw a figure in a strangely broad hat and a long black garment coming down from the wood. It looked like a man wearing women's clothes. Slowly, the figure drew nearer, and I could now see that it really was a man wearing a kind of black robe that reached to his feet. At the sight of him, I was overcome with fear, which rapidly grew into deadly terror as the frightful recognition shot through my mind. That is a Jesuit. Shortly before, I had overheard a conversation between my father and a visiting colleague concerning the nefarious activities of the Jesuits. From the half-irritated, half-fearful tone of my father's remarks, I gathered that Jesuits meant something specially dangerous, even for my father. Actually, I had no idea what Jesuits were, but I was familiar with the word Jesus from my little prayer. The man coming down the road must be in disguise, I thought. That was why he wore women's clothes. Probably he had evil intentions. Terrified, I ran helter-skelter into the house, rushed up the stairs, and hid under a beam in the darkest corner of the attic. I don't know how long I remained there, but it must have been a fairly long time, because when I ventured down again to the first floor and cautiously stuck my head out of the window, far and wide there was not a trace of the black figure to be seen. For days afterwards, the hellish fright clung to my limbs and kept me in the house. And even when I began to play in the road again, the wooded hilltop was still the object of my uneasy vigilance. Later I realized, of course, that the black figure was a harmless Catholic priest. At about the same time, I could not say with absolute certainty whether it preceded this experience or not. I had the earliest dream I can remember. A dream which was to preoccupy me all my life. I was then between 3 and 4 years old. The vicarage stood quite alone near Laufen Castle, and there was a big meadow stretching back from the sexton's farm. In the dream, I was in this meadow. Suddenly I discovered a dark, rectangular, stone-lined hole in the ground. I had never seen it before. I ran forward curiously and peered down into it. Then I saw a stone stairway leading down. Hesitantly and fearfully, I descended. At the bottom was a doorway with a round arch, closed off by a green curtain. It was a big, heavy curtain of worked stuff like brocade, and it looked very sumptuous. Curious to see what might be hidden behind, I pushed it aside. I saw before me in the dim light a rectangular chamber about 30 feet long. The ceiling was arched and of hewn stone. The floor was laid with flagstones, and in the center a red carpet ran from the entrance to a low platform. On this platform stood a wonderfully rich golden throne. I am not certain, but perhaps a red cushion lay on the seat. It was a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it which I thought at first was a tree trunk 12 to 15 feet high and about 1.5 to 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing, reaching almost to the ceiling. But it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head, with no face and no hair. On the very top of the head was a single eye gazing motionlessly upward. It was fairly light in the room, although there were no windows and no apparent source of light. Above the head, however, was an aura of brightness. The thing did not move, yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep toward me. I was paralyzed with terror. At that moment, I heard from outside and above me my mother's voice. She called out, "Yes, just look at him. That is the man-eater." That intensified my terror still more, and I awoke sweating and scared to death. For many nights afterward, I was afraid to go to sleep because I feared I might have another dream like that. This dream haunted me for years. Only much later did I realize that what I had seen was a phallus, and it was decades before I understood that it was a ritual phallus. I could never make out whether my mother meant, "This is the man-eater," or "That is the man-eater." In the first case, she would have meant that not Lord Jesus or the Jesuit was the devourer of little children, but the phallus. In the second case, that the man-eater in general was symbolized by the phallus, so that the Dark Lord Jesus, the Jesuit, and the phallus were identical. The abstract significance of the phallus is shown by the fact that it was enthroned by itself, ithaphalically, upright. The hole in the meadow probably represented a grave. The grave itself was an underground temple, whose green curtain symbolized the meadow. In other words, the mystery of earth with her covering of green vegetation. The carpet was blood red. What about the vault? Perhaps I had already been to the Muño, the citadel of Schaffhausen. This is not likely, since no one would take a 3-year-old child up there, so it cannot be a memory trace. Equally, I do not know where the anatomically correct phallus can have come from. The interpretation of the orificium urethrae as an eye, with the source of light apparently above it, points to the etymology of the word phallus, shining bright. At all events, the phallus of this dream seems to be a subterranean god not to be named, and such it remained throughout my youth, reappearing whenever anyone spoke too emphatically about Lord Jesus. Lord Jesus never became quite real for me, never quite acceptable, never quite lovable, for again and again I would think of his underground counterpart, a frightful revelation which had been accorded me without my seeking it. The Jesuits' disguise cast its shadow over the Christian doctrine I had been taught. Often it seemed to me a solemn masquerade, a kind of funeral at which the mourners put on serious or mournful faces, but the next moment were secretly laughing and not really sad at all. Lord Jesus seemed to me in some ways a god of death. Helpful, it is true, in that he scared away the terrors of the night, but himself, uncanny, a crucified and bloody corpse. Secretly, his love and kindness, which I always heard praised, appeared doubtful to me, chiefly because the people who talked most about dear Lord Jesus wore black frock coats and shiny black boots, which reminded me of burials. They were my father's colleagues, as well as 8 of my uncles, all parsons. For many years, they inspired fear in me, not to speak of occasional Catholic priests who reminded me of the terrifying Jesuit who had irritated and even alarmed my father. In later years and until my confirmation, I made every effort to force myself to take the required positive attitude to Christ, but I could never succeed in overcoming my secret distrust. The fear of the black man, which is felt by every child, was not the essential thing in that experience. It was, rather, the recognition that stabbed through my childish brain. That is a Jesuit. So the important thing in the dream was its remarkable symbolic setting and the astounding interpretation. That is the man-eater. Not the child's ogre of a man-eater, but the fact that this was the man-eater, and that it was sitting on a golden throne beneath the earth. For my childish imagination, it was first of all the king who sat on a golden throne. Then, on a much more beautiful and much higher and much more golden throne far, far away in the blue sky, sat God and Lord Jesus with golden crowns and white robes. Yet from this same Lord Jesus came the Jesuit in black women's garb with a broad black hat down from the wooded hill. I had to glance up there every so often to see whether another danger might not be approaching. In the dream, I went down into the hole in the earth and found something very different on a golden throne, something non-human and underworldly, which gazed fixedly upward and fed on human flesh. It was only 50 years later that a passage in a study of religious ritual burned into my eyes concerning the motif of cannibalism that underlies the symbolism of the Mass. Only then did it become clear to me how exceedingly unchildlike, how sophisticated and over-sophisticated was the thought that had begun to break through into consciousness in those 2 experiences. Who was it speaking in me? Whose mind had devised them? What kind of superior intelligence was at work? I know every numbskull will babble on about black man, man-eater, chance, and retrospective interpretation, in order to banish something terribly inconvenient that might sully the familiar picture of childhood innocence. Ah, these good, efficient, healthy-minded people, they always remind me of those optimistic tadpoles who bask in a puddle in the sun, in the shallowest of waters, crowding together and amiably wriggling their tails, totally unaware that the next morning the puddle will have dried up and left them stranded. Who spoke to me then? Who talked of problems far beyond my knowledge? Who brought the above and below together and laid the foundation for everything that was to fill the second half of my life with stormiest passion? Who but that alien guest who came both from above and from below? Through this childhood dream, I was initiated into the secrets of the earth. What happened then was a kind of burial in the earth, and many years were to pass before I came out again. Today I know that it happened in order to bring the greatest possible amount of light into the darkness. It was an initiation into the realm of darkness. My intellectual life had its unconscious beginnings at that time. I no longer remember our move to Kleinhuningen near Basel in 1879, but I do have a memory of something that happened several years later, One evening, my father took me out of bed and carried me in his arms to our porch, which faced west. He showed me the evening sky shimmering in the most glorious green. That was after the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. Another time, my father took me outside and showed me a large comet on the eastern horizon. And once there was a great flood. The river Wees, which flowed through the village, had broken its dam, and in its upper reaches a bridge had collapsed. 14 people were drowned and were carried down by the yellow floodwater to the Rhine. When the water retreated, some of the corpses got stuck in the sand. When I was told about it, there was no holding me. I actually found the body of a middle-aged man in a black frock coat. Apparently he had just come from church. He lay half covered by sand, his arm over his eyes. Similarly, I was fascinated to watch a pig being slaughtered. To the horror of my mother, I watched the whole procedure. She thought it terrible, but the slaughtering and the dead man were simply matters of interest to me. My earliest memories of art go back to those years at Klein-Huningen. The house where my parents lived was the 18th century parsonage, and in it there was a dark room. Here all the furniture was good, and old paintings hung on the walls. I particularly remember an Italian painting of David and Goliath. It was a mirror copy from the workshop of Guido Reni. The original hangs in the Louvre. How it came into our family, I do not know. There was another old painting in that room which now hangs in my son's house, a landscape of Basel dating from the early 19th century. Often I would steal into that dark, sequestered room and sit for hours in front of the pictures, gazing at all this beauty. It was the only beautiful thing I knew. About that time, I must still have been a very little fellow, no more than 6 years old. An aunt took me to Basel and showed me the stuffed animals in the museum. We stayed a long time because I wanted to look at everything very carefully. At 4 o'clock the bell rang, a sign that the museum was about to close. My aunt nagged at me, but I could not tear myself away from the showcases. In the meantime, the room had been locked, and we had to go by another way to the staircase, through the gallery of antiquities. Suddenly I was standing before these marvelous figures, utterly overwhelmed. I opened my eyes wide, for I had never seen anything so beautiful. I could not look at them long enough. My aunt pulled me by the hand to the exit, I trailing always a step behind her, crying out, "Disgusting boy, shut your eyes! Disgusting boy, shut your eyes!" Only then did I see that the figures were naked and wore fig leaves. I hadn't noticed it at all before. Such was my first encounter with the fine arts. My aunt was simmering with indignation, as though she had been dragged through a pornographic institute. When I was 6 years old, my parents took me on an excursion to Arlesheim. On this occasion, my mother wore a dress I have never forgotten, and it is the only dress of hers that I can recall. It was of some black stuff, printed all over with little green crescents. My earliest recollection of my mother is of a slender young woman wearing this dress. In all my other memories, she is older and corpulent. We came to a church, and my mother said, "That is a Catholic church." My curiosity, mingled with fear, prompted me to slip away from my mother and peer through the open door into the interior. I just had time to glimpse the big candles on a richly adorned altar. It was around Easter, when I suddenly stumbled on a step and struck my chin on a piece of iron. I remember that I had a gash that was bleeding badly when my parents picked me up. My state of mind was curious. On the one hand, I was ashamed because my screams were attracting the attention of the churchgoers, and on the other hand, I felt that I had done something forbidden. Jesuits, green curtain, secret of the man-eater. So that is the Catholic Church, which has to do with Jesuits. It is their fault that I stumbled and screamed. For years afterward, I was unable to set foot inside a Catholic church without a secret fear of blood and falling and Jesuits. That was the aura or atmosphere that hung about it. But at the same time, it always fascinated me. The proximity of a Catholic priest made me even more uneasy, if that were possible. Not until I was in my 30s was I able to confront Mater Ecclesia without this sense of oppression. The first time was in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Soon after I was 6, my father began giving me Latin lessons, and I also went to school. I did not mind school. It was easy for me since I was always ahead of the others and had learned to read before I went there. However, I remember a time when I could not yet read, but pestered my mother to read aloud to me out of the Orbis Pictus, an old, richly illustrated children's book which contained an account of exotic religions, especially that of the Hindus. There were illustrations of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which I found an inexhaustible source of interest. My mother later told me that I always returned to these pictures. Whenever I did so, I had an obscure feeling of their affinity with my original revelation, which I never spoke of to anyone. It was a secret I must never betray. Indirectly, my mother confirmed this feeling, for the faint tone of contempt with which she spoke of heathens did not escape me. I knew that she would reject my revelation with horror, and I did not want to expose myself to any such injury. This unchildlike behavior was connected on the one hand with an intense sensitivity and vulnerability, on the other hand, and this especially, with the loneliness of my early youth. My sister was born 9 years after me. I played alone and in my own way. Unfortunately, I cannot remember what I played. I recall only that I did not want to be disturbed. I was deeply absorbed in my games and could not endure being watched or judged while I played them. My first concrete memory of games dates from my 7th or 8th year. I was passionately fond of playing with bricks and built towers which I then rapturously destroyed by an earthquake. Between my 8th and 11th years, I drew endlessly, battle pictures, sieges, bombardments, naval engagements. Then I filled a whole exercise book with ink blots and amused myself giving them fantastic interpretations. One of my reasons for liking school was that there I found at last the playmates I had lacked for so long. At school, I also discovered something else, but before I go into this, I should first mention that the nocturnal atmosphere had begun to thicken. All sorts of things were happening at night, things incomprehensible and alarming. My parents were sleeping apart. I slept in my father's room. From the door to my mother's room came frightening influences. At night, mother was strange and mysterious. One night I saw coming from her door a faintly luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself from the neck and floated along in front of it, in the air like a little moon. Immediately, another head was produced and again detached itself. This process was repeated 6 or 7 times. I had anxiety dreams of things that were now small, now large. For instance, I saw a tiny ball at a great distance. Gradually it approached, growing steadily into a monstrous and suffocating object. Or I saw telegraph wires with birds sitting on them, and the wires grew thicker and thicker and my fear greater until the terror awoke me. Although these dreams were overtures to the physiological changes of puberty, they had in their turn a prelude which occurred about my 7th year. At that time, I was sick with pseudo-croup, accompanied by choking fits. One night during an attack, I stood at the foot of the bed, my head bent back over the bed rail, while my father held me under the arms. Above me I saw a glowing blue circle about the size of the full moon, and inside it moved golden figures which I thought were angels. This vision was repeated, and each time it allayed my fear of suffocation. but the suffocation returned in the anxiety dreams. I see in this a psychogenic factor. The atmosphere of the house was beginning to be unbreathable, and I hated going to church. The one exception was Christmas Day. The Christmas carol, "This is the day that God has made," pleased me enormously. And then in the evening, of course, came the Christmas tree. Christmas was the only Christian festival I could celebrate with fervor. All others left me cold. New Year's Eve alone had something of the attractiveness of Christmas, but definitely took second place. Advent had a quality about it that somehow did not fit in with the coming Christmas. It had to do with night, storms, and wind, and also with the darkness of the house. There was something whispering, something queer going on. I return now to the discovery I made in the course of associating with my rustic schoolmates. I found that they alienated me from myself. When I was with them, I became different from the way I was at home. I joined in their pranks, or invented ones which at home would never have occurred to me, so it seemed. Although, as I knew only too well, I could hatch up all sorts of things when I was alone. It seemed to me that the change in myself was due to the influence of my school fellows, who somehow misled me or compelled me to be different from what I thought I was. The influence of this wider world, this world which contained others besides my parents, seemed tome dubious, if not altogether suspect, and in some obscure way, hostile. Though I became increasingly aware of the beauty of the bright daylight world where golden sunlight filters through green leaves, at the same time I had a premonition of an inescapable world of shadows filled with frightening, unanswerable questions, which had me at their mercy. My nightly prayer did, of course, grant me a ritual protection, since it concluded the day properly and just as properly ushered in night and sleep. But the new peril lurked by day. It was as if I sensed a splitting of myself and feared it. My inner security was threatened. I also recall from this period 7 to 9 that I was fond of playing with fire. In our garden there was an old wall built of large blocks of stone, the interstices of which made interesting caves. I used to tend a little fire in one of these caves, with other children helping me. A fire that had to bum forever, and therefore had to be constantly maintained by our united efforts, which consisted in gathering the necessary wood. No one but myself was allowed to tend this fire. Others could light other fires in other caves, but these fires were profane and did not concern me. My fire alone was living and had an unmistakable aura of sanctity. In front of this wall was a slope in which was embedded a stone that jutted out, my stone. Often when I was alone, I sat down on this stone and then began an imaginary game that went something like this. I am sitting on top of this stone, and it is underneath. But the stone also could say I, and think, I am lying here on this slope, and he is sitting on top of me. The question then arose, am I the one who is sitting on the stone, or am I the stone on which he is sitting? This question always perplexed me, and I would stand up wondering who was what now. The answer remained totally unclear, and my uncertainty was accompanied by a feeling of curious and fascinating darkness. But there was no doubt whatsoever that this stone stood in some secret relationship to me. I could sit on it for hours, fascinated by the puzzle it set me. 30 years later, I again stood on that slope. I was a married man, had children, a house, a place in the world, and a head full of ideas and plans, and suddenly I was again the child who had kindled a fire full of secret significance and sat down on a stone without knowing whether it was I or I was it. I thought suddenly of my life in Zurich, and it seemed alien to me, like news from some remote world and time. This was frightening, for the world of my childhood, in which I had just become absorbed, was eternal, and I had been wrenched away from it and had fallen into a time that continued to roll onward, moving farther and farther away. The pull of that other world was so strong that I had to tear myself violently from the spot in order not to lose hold of my future. I have never forgotten that moment, for it illuminated in a flash of lightning the quality of eternity in my childhood. What this meant was revealed soon afterward in my 10th year. My disunion with myself and uncertainty in the world at large led me to an action which at the time was quite incomprehensible to me. I had in those days a yellow varnished pencil case of the kind commonly used by primary school pupils, with a little lock and the customary ruler. At the end of this ruler I now carved a little mannequin about 2 inches long, with frock coat, top hat, and shiny black boots. I colored him black with ink, sawed him off the ruler, and put him in the pencil case, where I made him a little bed. I even made a coat for him out of a bit of wool. In the case I also placed a smooth oblong blackish stone from the Rhine, which I had painted with watercolors to look as though it were divided into an upper and lower half, and had long carried around in my trouser pocket. This was his stone. All this was a great secret. Secretly, I took the case to the forbidden attic at the top of the house, forbidden because the floorboards were worm-eaten and rotten, and hid it with great satisfaction on one of the beams under the roof, for no one must ever see it. I knew that not a soul would ever find it there. No one could discover my secret and destroy it. I felt safe, and the tormenting sense of being at odds with myself was gone. In all difficult situations, whenever I had done something wrong or my feelings had been hurt, or when my father's irritability or my mother's invalidism oppressed me, I thought of my carefully bedded down and wrapped up mannequin and his smooth, prettily colored stone. From time to time, often at intervals of weeks, I secretly stole up to the attic when I could be certain that no one would see me. Then I clambered up on the beam, opened the case, and looked at my mannequin and his stone. Each time I did this, I placed in the case a little scroll of paper on which I had previously written something during school hours in a secret language of my own invention. The addition of a new scroll always had the character of a solemn ceremonial act. Unfortunately, I cannot remember what I wanted to communicate to the mannequin. I only know that my letters constituted a kind of library for him. I fancy, though I cannot be certain, that they may have consisted of sayings that particularly pleased me. The meaning of these actions, or how I might explain them, never worried me. I contented myself with the feeling of newly won security, and was satisfied to possess something that no one knew and no one could get at. It was an inviolable secret which must never be betrayed, for the safety of my life depended on it. Why that was so, I did not ask myself. It simply was. So this possession of a secret had a very powerful formative influence on my character. I consider it the essential factor of my boyhood. Similarly, I never told anyone about the dream of the phallus, and the Jesuit, too, belonged to that mysterious realm which I knew I must not talk about. The little wooden figure with the stone was a first attempt, still unconscious and childish, to give shape to the secret. I was always absorbed by it and had the feeling I ought to fathom it, and yet I did not know what it was I was trying to express. I always hoped I might be able to find something, perhaps in nature, that would give me the clue and show me where or what the secret was. At that time, my interest in plants, animals, and stones grew. I was constantly on the lookout for something mysterious. Consciously, I was religious in the Christian sense, though always with the reservation, but it is not so certain as all that. Or, what about that thing under the ground? And when religious teachings were pumped into me and I was told, This is beautiful and this is good, I would think to myself, yes, but there is something else, something very secret that people don't know about. The episode with the carved mannequin formed the climax and the conclusion of my childhood. It lasted about a year. Thereafter, I completely forgot the whole affair until I was 35. Then this fragment of memory rose up again from the mists of childhood with pristine clarity, while I was engaged on the preliminary studies for my book Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. I read about the cache of soul, stones near Arlesheim, and the Australian Churingas. I suddenly discovered that I had a quite definite image of such a stone, though I had never seen any reproductions. It was oblong, blackish, and painted into an upper and lower half. This image was joined by that of the pencil box and the mannequin. The mannequin was a little cloaked god of the ancient world, a telesphorus such as stands on the monuments of Asclepios and reads to him from a scroll. Along with this recollection, there came to me for the first time the conviction that there are archaic psychic components which have entered the individual psyche without any direct line of tradition. My father's library, which I examined only very much later, contained not a single book which might have transmitted any such information. Moreover, my father demonstrably knew nothing about these things. When I was in England in 1920, I carved out of wood two similar figures without having the slightest recollection of that childhood experience. One of them I had reproduced on a larger scale in stone, and this figure now stands in my garden in Kuznacht. Only while I was doing this work did the unconscious supply me with a name. It called the figure Atmavikto, the breath of life. It was a further development of that fearful tree of my childhood dream, which was now revealed as the breath of life, the creative impulse. Ultimately, the mannequin was a Kabir, wrapped in his little cloak, hidden in the kista, and provided with a supply of life force, the oblong black stone. But these are connections which became clear to me only much later in life. When I was a child, I performed the ritual just as I have seen it done by the natives of Africa. They act first and do not know what they are doing. Only long afterward do they reflect on what they have done.